A good political speech has the power to inform and inspire, to unite, to encourage, to console, and once in a while to define and articulate the dreams of a people or a nation. The role of the speechwriter has grown and changed, and people have become more aware of the profession with the popularity of dramas such as A House of Cards. But how does a real speechwriter work with the politician, and what really goes on behind the scenes in the halls of power? To better understand the role and the reality of a speechwriter in the White House, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by John McConnell, speechwriter for former U.S. President George W. Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray.
A lifelong enthusiast of politics, John McConnell worked as principal speechwriter for Vice President Dan Quayle and 1996 presidential candidate Bob Dole. With the election of George W. Bush as U.S. President, McConnell served as senior speechwriter during all 8 years of the subsequent Bush administration, holding the unique dual position of assistant to the Vice President and deputy assistant to the President. He co-authored eulogies by Mr. Bush and Mr. Cheney for President Ronald Reagan, remarks following the loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia, and the President's remarks on September 14, 2001 at the National Cathedral in Washington. He was part of the three-person team responsible for all of the 43rd President's major addresses, including the speech to the joint session of Congress after September 11, 2001, and 4 State of the Union messages.
Welcome to Dialogue, John.
Thank you, Mr.
What
Young.
was the question most asked by your colleagues, friends, or family members about your former career as speechwriter for President Bush?
The most common question would be, what is it like to work for a president? And also, what is the best thing about working for a president? The first part, working for a president, of course, it's a great experience for a speechwriter because you're at the center of action in terms of the American government and the American political system. And then the part about what's the best thing about it is, working for a president that you like, someone you admire, someone you know, and I could say that that was definitely true in my case. I started working for him when he was the governor of Texas. He was running for president and worked on that campaign in 2000, and then just followed him up to Washington, D.C. when he became the president.
Has it ever occurred to you that it might be a good idea to give up the job because someday you might get tired of politics itself?
Some people do get tired of politics for various reasons. It's a very high-intensity game, as you know, the political world. When you know, there's relentless hard work involved. One thing about working at the White House was that if you made a plan for your week, let's say on Sunday afternoon you mapped out how your entire week was going to go, I would say by Monday afternoon your entire week's plan was gone because events changed, things were always being altered, events intervened with your plans. There were many, of course, many unexpected things that happened, and you just had to be ready for that. And I think for a lot of speechwriters and a lot of people in different offices in government and politics, the relentless pace sometimes is a little bit too much to continue year after year.
We have a popular Chinese saying, 有国无家. You keep in mind the priorities of the government's agenda or the highest interests of the government, the nation, instead of your time, leisure time with the family. Is that also, or was that also your concern, your complaints of your wife?
Well, I didn't have a wife, and your family does have to come first in your life. Mm-hmm. And if your job ever starts to intrude on your family in a serious way, and that's a decision each person has to make on their own, then it's time to move on. You don't want to miss too much family time, but there are sacrifices.
Have you ever written anything that you don't quite like? I mean, you don't always agree with the president. In that embarrassing situation, what would you do?
Well, I've been a speechwriter for most of my career. As you mentioned, at the beginning I worked for Vice President Dan Quayle during the administration of President George Bush. I worked for Senator Bob Dole when he was running for president in 1996. And then of course for President Bush and Vice President Cheney and several other national candidates since then. I couldn't sit here and say that everything I ever wrote was something I agreed with completely. There were times it's important that if you're working in a political context, you want to be generally in sync with the person you're working for. Otherwise, the job will be much more difficult. What kind of a difference do you feel you're making? Let's say if you're working in a presidential campaign and you don't really agree with what you're writing, well, why don't you just go work for the other candidate?
Did you ever review your innermost feeling or sentiments about the dislikes in front of the president? Say, sorry, this part I feel confused. I don't have any idea. Let me have your thoughts instead.
No, there was never
No.
never anything that was so major that I would bring it up to the president. No.
What were the favorite or most favorite catchphrases that President Bush would love to use each time in his speech? For example, the words of freedom, values, belief, faith, religion. What were those words?
He did talk a lot about freedom, and he did talk a lot about values. I would say one phrase that President Bush, I don't remember ever removing from a speech, was the phrase, "I am responsible." He believed that the presidency was an office of great responsibility, and he was never hesitant to speak of it in those terms. Aside from that, he wouldn't make a lot of personal references to himself. It was really more about the subject matter at hand.
Presidents did have their own slip of tongue, and you may not assume the responsibility because you were the speechwriter, not responsible for the presentation itself. So let's come back to examine the process of speech writing itself. How did you prepare? You enjoyed the support from a whole team. There were a lot of statistics in the State of the Union speech, for example, and it must be an obvious journey for you to write something that would please the President and above all to please the big audience of the whole country.
Well, the State of the Union speech was, of course, probably the most prominent speech of any given year, because that's the one time that the President of the United States stands before the Congress and the Cabinet and the Diplomatic Corps and
lawmakers
others.
In the military.
That's right.
Some
the
of
joint,
the guys selected deliberately by the
Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yes.
And so, understandably, the preparation for the State of the Union speech is very elaborate, lengthy. The work begins on that at a policy level in the months preceding the event. And then, in my experience, the ones I worked on with my colleagues, we would start outlining how the speech might come together around the end of the year, Christmas time. And then the speech was typically scheduled near the end of January, and we would start writing right after the New Year. And it was an elaborate process. The speech had to be very carefully vetted because it covered so many different policy areas. And as a speechwriter, you have the considerable task of getting all of this material into a manageable length. And that was always a challenge with the State of the Union.
Politics is a theater. It's a lot of drama. It's a show on the center stage of the D.C. And therefore, for a speechwriter, you have to be very careful about the bipartisan wrangling. It's always about the issue of politics, and politics could be very boring. Casual policy speech in front of the big crowd in the town hall meeting would be very fascinating and impressive. You're watching Dialogue with John McConnell, former speechwriter for President Bush in the White House. He also wrote speeches for Vice President Dick Cheney and Dan Quayle. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us, please. Welcome back. I got to be honest with you, among all the presidents since the end of the Second World War, Ronald Reagan is my favorite.
Is he?
I interviewed Jimmy Carter 3 times. I never had the luxury of interviewing Ronald Reagan, who delivered a speech at Fudan University back in 1984. At the very beginning, he used the punchline from the Chinese tradition, Chinese culture. He said, running a big country is like cooking small fish. 治大国若烹小鲜. I was impressed deeply by the quote from Chinese philosophy. What do you think of the popularity and the charisma of Ronald Reagan? Did he often speak with a few notes instead of using speeches well written by people like you?
Well, I would also say, in the case of Ronald Reagan, he was a very accomplished speechwriter in his own right, because he had been a prominent public speaker around the United States for literally decades prior to his election as president, and prior to even his first political office, which was governor in the state of California. He was just a very, very fluid and fluent, accomplished public speaker, and a very good writer. The records are now there to see in the Reagan Presidential Library.
Was that partly because he was a radio announcer before becoming governor of California?
Yeah, I think that had a lot to do with it, and it's presumptuous of me, but you're a broadcaster, and broadcasters tend to become very articulate in their work, because you're constantly aware of an audience and careful with your words, and Reagan, so he developed that skill. Now, of course, when he became president, like every president of the modern era, he didn't have time to write his speeches. All of them have been capable of writing speeches, but practically speaking, they don't have the time to do that. So Reagan had a speechwriting team, and I've met a number of them over the years, and they will tell you about how some of the best contributions to the work they did for the president came from the president himself, and I can testify to the same.
One of the major reasons for Ronald Reagan to win the second term was a famous question: are you better off? In one of the speeches he delivered to the big audience of his country, and most of the Americans said yes, unanimously. So he won the second term. Although he was criticized by Walter Mondale, the challenger from Democrats, for the age. He looked old. But what do you think of his sense of humor? He was assassinated.
Attempted assassination.
Yeah, he was. Is an assassination attempt by Hinckley. And the moment he woke up, he said something that shocked the whole world sweetly. What do you think of his sense of humor? Perhaps it's because of the background of Hollywood, or something unique about his character? Well,
Reagan had that background as a performer, but also he was, it was, I think, part of the essence of his personality. He was a warm, by all accounts, Ronald Reagan was a very warm, genuine person, and he was always able to make an individual connection with people. So the incident you're referring to, March 30th, 1981, when he was shot, along with his press secretary, a Secret Service man, and a policeman by a man with a gun outside a hotel in Washington, they put the president into the limousine very quickly to dodge the bullets. The Secret Service men thought they had avoided the president's being hit, but on their way to the White House, he sat the president up in the seat and saw that he was coughing blood. Mm-hmm. And he told the driver to get them immediately to a hospital, which is not far from the White House. But by diverting that fast, they saved his life, because he was in serious danger. And so he, believe it or not, walked in to the hospital.
Oh, really?
Yes.
He
but
was on his own.
He walked on his own power.
Mm-hmm.
But then my understanding is he collapsed after coming in the inner doors of the hospital. And then they put him on the stretcher, and they prepared him, for surgery immediately. And Mrs. Reagan was brought to see him before he went into surgery. And he said, he saw her and he said, "Honey, I forgot to duck." It shows great presence of mind,
Exactly.
and that goes more to the man's character than to his background as an entertainer. I think it just goes to the personal
enormous
character of
efforts
the man.
with which he walked into the hospital reminded me of what Franklin Roosevelt did after Pearl Harbor attack. He tried to stand from the wheelchair to show his political will in front of the world. Look, we're going to fight. We're going to defeat the Japanese Nazism. What do you think of the strength coming out of a powerful speech? That's something you always consider how to inject into.
Yes, I think a good speech is important, not just to convey the ideas of the person, but to convey a sense of the person's values, what they think is important, their general character. You refer to Franklin Roosevelt. It's interesting that although he had been at the age of 39 struck down by polio and never walked again unassisted, when he was president, most people didn't know this. They knew he had suffered from polio, but I think people thought he was a little bit disabled, but it was not generally known that the man was unable to walk. But newspaper editorial cartoons very often depicted him as a boxer or as a runner, and anything other than a man in a wheelchair. He was viewed by people as a man of action and strength, and that was not something he could project physically, but it is something he projected in the confidence of his speech, in the words that he spoke, and
he presented a very good image of a wartime leader when he was badly needed to inspire millions of Americans and indeed people from around to fight fascism.
And did not survive to see the war end.
He was the longest serving U.S. president in my living memory, and he deserves the respect.
He's the longest ever.
Yeah.
12 years.
Really? Okay, good. But what about Abraham Lincoln, who delivered the Gettysburg speech? That was remembered as perhaps the best among all in the U.S. history. What do you think of the speech he generated himself instead of relying on people like you, the ghostwriter?
Not until the 20th century did American presidents have speechwriters. The first president to have speechwriting help was, to the best of our knowledge, President Warren G. Harding, who was elected in 1920. Prior to that, presidents didn't give 500 speeches a year. It was a far, far different world, and so they did write their own. And of course, Lincoln, being the most eloquent of all of them, the Gettysburg Address that you refer to was the dedication of a military cemetery right after the Battle of Gettysburg, which was one of the bloodiest of the Civil War. And the speech was just, I mean, it was under 300 words. And it kind of came and went. If you read the historical accounts of it, people barely were aware in some instances that the president had started to speak, and he was done. It was such a short speech, and he was not the principal speaker of the event. There was another man named Edward Everett, who I believe spoke for an hour and a half or something like that. And so in Lincoln's case, it wasn't anything with the presentation. It was the power of the words and the beauty of them that really stood the test of time.
Let's look at the speech writing itself. John, American attention span is pretty short, just maybe 5 to 4 minutes, period. Now, is it a very important requirement to generate a very short and powerful speech so that people will not click the channels and turn to other sources of information? What do you think of the duration of the speech itself?
It's always important, it seems to me, as a general rule, to make your points and finish it. We don't live in a time where people expect lengthy, involved, oratorical speeches, that go on for an hour or more. It's just not the nature of the era we live in. It's a conversational era. I do also believe, however, that a speech on an important matter that people will listen to. Again, it doesn't have to be extremely long, but if the subject matter is important enough and people are interested in it, they're not going to, they're not going to say, well, this is too long, this is more than 5 minutes or whatever. And
this is
on.
common sense, John, but technically, what are the most important elements you have to inject into the writing itself so that people would be kept mesmerized and they would listen?
Well, it's hard to mesmerize people, but you can hold people's attention by respecting them, speaking directly to them, not down to them, giving them your best thoughts, explaining why you think as you do, and just generally getting to the point as opposed to avoiding the point or going off into extraneous matters. Just be clear and direct and respectful, and in my observation, whoever is speaking will hold an audience.
Could you raise one example to illustrate that you did keep the listeners in your mind in writing that particular speech? What kind of words or phrases you would choose to close the gap between the speaker and the audience?
There weren't any, I wouldn't say there were words or phrases that were used for the purpose of holding attention. Rather, you use words and phrases for the purpose of just expressing your point in a way that doesn't sound like something they've heard 100 times. Your challenge as a speechwriter is to avoid language that can be heard, or adjectives that have been heard 1,000,000 times in the same setting, common phrases that are just used too often in politics, things of that nature. That's what you watch for. You try to avoid those, because if you start speaking, this is true in speech writing generally, when any of us hears a speech and it has kind of a vague ring of something we've heard 100 times on cable television or something like that, that's when people's attention starts to wander. I don't have to listen to this, I've heard it.
Among the most interesting and important speeches you wrote for the President or Vice President, I was told that you helped write a speech in the week after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And that one must be very inspiring. What did you say in the speech? What were the key words you have to use so that the attention of the whole country would be focused on the speech and the speech itself?
Yes, you're referring to the speech to the Congress after the attacks of September 11th. So that was Thursday, September 20th, 2001. And of course, I was not the principal author. I was part of a team that worked on those speeches. It was the aftermath of the worst attack on the United States homeland in our history, and it was the job of the President to reassure the nation that we were going to be safe, that we were in a struggle that was going to take time.
And did you think that this was a declaration of war?
Well, no, that's not what the speech did. And in a technical sense, presidents do not declare war. What it really was kind of an explanation of what the president understood to be the nature of the threat to the country, how the country was going to respond to the threat, and reassuring people that we would persevere through this challenge, and that even in this hour of grief, we had the strength as a nation and the presence of mind to go forward and to prevail against this enemy.
I was told speech writing is fast morphing into an interesting industry, and I believe this industry will shape up in China as well, since there is a big demand in the big market. Business leaders really want people like you to generate fascinating speeches which aspire to inspire their employees or their clients. So what do you think are the most important elements for such a business speech?
There's not a great deal of difference in a general sense across disciplines, whether it's politics or business or what have you. The elements of a good spoken message are going to be basically the same. Again, it's a tone of polished conversation, not an attempt at sort of uncommon or non-typical oratory, but rather just clarity and directness, a sense of the speaker's own personality. A good speech will convey the sincerity of the person. It will not invent sincerity. It will rather convey the actual sincerity of the person. It will sound true because it's coming from the heart. When I write a speech for an executive, for example, every executive that I have worked for, in the same sense of working for the President and others, each one of them knows more about their business than I will ever know. Each one of them has the ability to communicate, and each one of them has the confidence to stand up and speak. Mm-hmm. My job is to come in, and what I offer is experience in writing, mm-hmm. and the time to sit down and take that person's best thoughts and put them together in a way that makes him or her feel comfortable and confident in the language. Really, I'm saving them time and helping them to convey their own best thoughts, not mine, but theirs.
John, most of the time on there, we were discussing speech writing, but presentation is another matter, right? Execution of your best thoughts for him or her would have to be executed effectively in front of the audience or in front of the camera, the microphone. So what do you think are the most important skills for those guys to execute a good speech with the help of a teleprompter or without it?
Mm-hmm. Now, do we need to explain to the listeners what the teleprompter is, or pretty much? I usually explain the teleprompter as it is simply a device. It is an instrument where there are two glass panels on either side of the speaker in front of him or her, and then below it are little kind of TV screens that reflect the words of the speech off the panel, and they move. The speaker can see the words, but the audience cannot see them. They just see it through the clear glass. It's a very effective tool. President Reagan used it a lot. President Obama used it a lot.
Thank you so much, John, for briefing us on the skills of speech writing, the presidency you came to know, as well as why it is important to have this industry of speech writing in the 21st century, when we're going to have the AI, artificial intelligence, to make your job less and less important.
Thank you, Mr. Young.
I'm joking. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.